right, testing, testing. All right. It is 5 o'clock, and I will call this special work session to order. As you can see on the agenda, we have several items to work through, but I'm actually going to hand it over to Vice Chair Lynn and Director Irvin to guide us through this work session, as they have been the board liaisons for this work. So Marvin and Tristan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Ben. First of all, I want to say thank you to everybody for coming. I know this is an extra session, and I know how busy everybody is. It's the start of the year, and there's just a lot going on. So thank you. Hopefully we can get through this quickly. But tonight, the idea is to really start to look at outcomes associated with the previous plan to try to understand where we are when we talked about that. And then to think about some of the next steps. We will also review a request for proposal draft that David Moore will present. And then Tristan and I will present the theory of action draft, as well as we will have a conversation about the strategic plan committee composition. All right, so if we could ask Dr. Sue and David Moore to talk about the outcomes associated with the strategic financial plan.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and Lynn and Director Irvin. This evening, first out, I will ask Director David Moore to walk us through the district strategic financial plan. We have also asked our assessment coordinator and all things data, Paul Verstraete, is here as well to answer any questions relative to measurement. But without further ado, I think we'll have Director Moore take us through the strategic plan, financial plan that basically helps us all understand how we allocate fiscal resource to the outcomes that are directed through the strategic plan, what those measurements have been historically, and as a starting place for you to consider what measures would you like to see going forward as well. So with that, Director Moore.
So this evening, I've prepared a very brief slideshow on kind of an overview of what is a strategic financial plan and some of the fundamentals of our Smarter School Spending program. And I don't know if you guys want me to wait until they get the slideshow up there, or if you just want to listen. You got it on your screens. It was part of the agenda. Got it? And there's also several or a handful of additional documents that are attached to the agenda that kind of give you examples of supporting the work of Smarter School Spending. Okay. So the first slide after the title page is titled, "What is a strategic financial plan?" So there can be some confusing it with an annual budget, but it's not an annual document. It's a multi-year document, 3 to 5 years. Our very first one, we're in our 5th year. kind of on the tail end of the strategic plan, but within that 3 to 5 year period, we're reviewing that on an annual basis. So the board readopts, we update the strategic financial plan, and it goes in tandem with the adoption of the budget because it becomes part of the the adopted budget document. So the board readopts that plan each June. So we're basically within that strategic financial plan. We're not taking our current budget and rolling it forward with increase in cost factors. It's more about looking at targeted investments and the cost of those and the differences they're making in student outcomes. And we did link a copy of the plan that was adopted this past June in the agenda also. And in a nutshell, that includes information about what our targeted investments have been over the last 5 years and the amount of dollars invested in addition to any outcomes and how those outcomes have been measured. In addition, we always include, we like to talk about sustainability when we're talking about our strategic financial plan. So there's a 5-year forecast of the district's general fund that has been shown over 5 years. Director Lynn?
Director Moore, will you talk about how the investments or the targeted investments are directly linked to specific goals associated with the strategic plan?
Yeah, so within the document itself, there's a framework section for each of the strategic investments. So I do have a slide later that goes over those, and we can talk about that in a minute. But generally, for each of those frameworks, we have those areas of documentation that I talked to about as far as a description of the program and then how it might support the cornerstones of the current strategic plan, in addition to a history of the investments over the last 5 years, and then the measurements and what are the outcomes been as far as those measurements are concerned. Also, to identify here in this, what is it and what is it not, as far as accountability and return on investment, there's continued evaluation of program. So if that's why we're looking at those outcomes or those measurements and how the outcomes were attained or not when it comes to goals. And then, so that goes along with the last point there. It's not a static document. And it's not the information within the document should evolve on an annual basis. Looking at if we see, for instance, if we saw progress in the early learning program in the first year or two, which is true in our district, we've ramped that up over the last 5 years, beginning with small investments. You always want to, when you're talking about smarter school spending, you don't want to just, depending on the program, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket the first year and then have to pull stuff back if it's not working. We started with a minimum number of early learning classrooms in our district, and then we've added, and we're to the point where we're getting ready to open an early learning center, which is exciting. So that's kind of an overview of what is a strategic financial plan. Patty, if you can go to the next slide. So a big concept of smarter school spending, and specifically in the strategic financial plan, is what is academic return on investment, or AROI, as we call it for short. AROI is the practice of evaluating the cost effectiveness of academic programs, and then, like I just gave the example of early learning, allocating our resources accordingly. So it doesn't have to be a formula or a calculation. It very well could be. Sometimes it's obvious, like the example I gave with early learning, where those investments are making a difference for those kids that are coming into school their first few years. Any questions on, we also refer to it as bang for your buck for shorthand. And we even had t-shirts made one year.
And forgive me, I'm new to all of this. So so when you talk about AROI, you're also looking at outcomes, right? Academic and other types of outcomes, and as part of that calculation.
Yeah, so it could be something as simple as an easy measurement would be growth in a particular measure. Maybe it's graduation rates. Maybe it's our one of our programs that's part of one of the strategic investments in the current plan is related to academic transition. So kids, a big grade level that we started at was kids transitioning from 8th to 9th grade and making that transition to high school. We should, we started that program, I think about 4 years ago. So those kids are likely, if they haven't graduated already, they're in their senior year, perhaps this year. And so if the program's working, one of the measurements could be graduation rates for that population of kids. And I know some of the data could be anecdotal. We hear about, we hear positive stories. A lot of times it's about stories. But it can be academic growth per dollar spent would be the return on investment measurement. Next slide, Patty. So this is what I was referring to early in response to Vice Chair Lynn's question. So these investments that we've made over the last 5 years have been guided by the 4 cornerstones of the strategic plan. And in 5 broad categories, we have instructional staff. So that would mean teachers hired for the classroom. And there's also a summary, and unfortunately, I don't have the plan in front of me, but there is a summary. We have a shorthand version at the beginning of the plan document. We call it the executive summary. And there's a table in there that shows the amount of dollars invested each year in each of these categories. So instructional staff would represent the amount spent on new classroom teachers each year. And we actually, up until last year, there was a couple of years where we were just kind of level as far as our number of teachers. But then with the student investment account that was brought on a year ago, you'll see a bump in 2021 with investment in classroom teachers. And then college and career, that can be anything from dropout prevention. So the program that I was speaking about earlier, where we had the kids transitioning from 8th to 9th grade, and I forget the name of the position, but we basically have coaches, licensed teachers that are coaches that work in small groups of those teachers and help them get acclimated to school at the high school level. And so that would be an example of something under, actually that's academic transitions. College and career could be anything related to career and technical education, or dual credit courses, early learning. We talked about that one. And then we also have, as part of our plan, the one-to-one initiative that's been implemented over a number of years, and it's financed by our bond. And we actually, our strategic financial plan steering committee actually did a project with the help of a consultant from district management group to evaluate the technology one-to-one program through their AROI curriculum. And Director Robson and I actually did a presentation at a national conference a couple of years ago, and shared our learnings and successes, and how it was very hard to evaluate that from an AROI standpoint. But we did find, small pockets of wins and successes to share. But we thought, since we chose that as our project, as part of this curriculum, to evaluate, we included it in the strategic financial plan. And we were fortunate to have our voters provide that resource, because when we went into distance learning, comprehensive distance learning a year ago, we were all set up we were already one-to-one with devices for each student. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? So was it part of the budget committee or district or cabinet to identify those bullet points, or was that part of working with the last board with their strategic plan to determine those 5 things? How were those landed upon?
Yeah, there was several stakeholder groups. Director Urban, as you mentioned, we're going to talk about, this is a slide later, but I want to go through it because it helps tie this process to our budget process. But we have a strategic financial plan steering committee, which has included board representation, and I believe our representatives for this board are Chair Bowman and Director Imus. And we haven't convened yet this year. We're targeting a meeting on the 20th, I believe. We haven't sent out an invite yet, but more to come on that. So that team includes cabinet, board representation, our financial staff, and student data staff. Paul Verstrate, and they're in the back there as part of that committee. And so we had an initial group that helped identify these areas. In addition, we had former board member and board chair Maureen Wolf, that was the lone representative. She was kind of one of the champions of this program, along with former Superintendent Ernie Brown, and then cabinet gives input, and then we tie it. I'll show later how we tie this with our overall budget process. Good question. Patty, next slide, please. So in addition to the 4 cornerstones, the last couple of years, we developed this district priorities framework to help document our priorities as a district, so we know, I think the question was asked earlier, how those investments tie in with the strategic plan and the goals of that. And so we identified, of course, additional district priorities that also support those 4 cornerstones. We have a culturally responsive teaching and leadership, culture and climate, and then human capital, and then an overarching priority of equity that weaves through all of those three priorities. And so this is an additional document to help hold our feet to the fire when it comes to student outcomes and growth.
So this document that you see here was developed during just prior to us entering into the Student Success Act work, trying to identify specific priorities where we wanted to leverage those dollars. And so we took that as an opportunity. The academic return on investment, the smarter school spending concept was part of a brainchild of what is now known as the District Management Group out of Boston, and a former retired superintendent by the name of Nate Levinson, who's written several books, and we can get you copies of that related to that concept. But in conjunction with the Graduate School of Education at Harvard and the Business School, Dr. John Kim is now the head of that. There was an urging of taking a look at your district strategic plan, if you had one, develop a theory of action if there isn't, and then work your priorities from there. And so we thought this was a perfect opportunity in preparation for the SSA work, community work, to develop that. And so that's where this roadmap was developed from. Now, as part of that, remember that was pre-pandemic. So I think that the priorities are correct, but some of the things that are underneath that in terms of initiatives and actions are probably a good place also to go back and reconsider and refine relative to this piece of work. All of the strategic plan, the priorities, and now that we are at 10 million or close to full funding this year, those priorities, that plan, have all been funded relative to this document.
Next slide, please, Maddie. So we also want to share some of the principles of smarter school spending. So this is an image or a diagram we like to show, especially those that are new to what smarter school spending might be. But as you know, in organizations like school districts, there's divergent stakeholder needs, and those divergent needs can influence how you allocate your resources. On the left-hand side, you see a little tug of war going on, and to represent those divergent needs and some of the influences that may lead to inappropriate allocation of resources as far as not being aligned with the district's goals, whether it's politics, who's speaking the loudest, leadership changes, school board whims, just to name a few. So as you can understand, that can lead to allocation of resources that don't align with the district's stated priorities. So we like to keep this picture in front of us just to remind us that we need to be intentional about sticking to our priorities and goals as a district when it comes to allocating resources. And there's still going to be those influences that will influence how decisions are made, and we just have to deal with those or overcome them to take the next steps. Next slide, Patty. Another lesson when it comes to smarter school spending, strategic budgeting. We're always reminding ourselves when it comes to aligning resources. I mentioned the small wins and the starting small with investments, and then increasing the investment when something becomes an important objective as far as positively impacting student growth and outcomes. And then it could be a situation where resources are scarce and you need dollars to put towards those top objectives. So there might be the need to repurpose other resources or reducing a program or reallocating. And those are never popular decisions. So you always want to communicate and involve the community in those decisions and your stakeholder groups. Otherwise, it's going to be seen as a top-down decision and not, it could backfire as far as the positive outcomes you're looking for. And then moving to the right, you always want to align your the resources that you're aligning include dollars, of course, people, and then use of time. We never, in schools, historically, we don't talk about time. We use the example, we did an example a few years ago where we took all the hourly rates of all the administrators in the district and consider that we have a half-day meeting once in a while with all those administrators. You apply that hourly rate to 4 hours a day with 50 administrators, it's a very large dollar amount. And it's just a reminder that everyone's time is valuable, including, you know, teachers, administrators, students. So that's a good reminder of consider that cost, that opportunity cost when we're all sitting here where we perhaps could be home doing something else. And although you guys aren't earning a paycheck, so and then in the end, keep in mind that as I was talking about reallocation of resources, these are hard decisions and they require multi-year planning. It's not something like a year ago, Dr. Ricky Smith had the vision of adding contract days to our school calendar with use of the ESSER dollars. Well, we knew we couldn't pull that. There would be too many strings to pull to make that happen this fall. So maybe it's something we can consider in future years. Any questions on some of those concepts? Next slide, Patty. So this is very small to read, and I also had it attached to the agenda as a separate document in case that's easier than looking at the slide in the slideshow. But as I mentioned earlier, it was our attempt last year to tie in the Smarter School spending process with our budgeting, our more formal budgeting process. So moving left to right, this is a timeline, but we start out with, in the first column of the boxes there, identified as board actions and cabinet actions, what are our strategic priorities as a district? So we have our mission and vision statement, and then the 4 cornerstones of the current strategic plan. And then going down, we have a summary of that priorities document that we just went over or touched upon, our theory of action, and then the district priorities. So that's kind of the foundation of our conversations that are year-round, basically. We don't. Another thing that strategic financial planning is it's not something that happens just in the springtime when we're getting ready to do our budget. We have the Strategic Financial Plan Steering Committee meets beginning of the school year and meets throughout the school year because that group is kind of the pilot of the airplane as far as identifying the progress with the current strategic investments, and then what are new strategic investments that are being proposed where student needs are seen. And so that group historically has met twice a month. We've talked about that changing that a little bit since we have board members that are part of the group this year that have commitments during the day. And since there's a lot of staff involved, historically we've met during the day, but we're looking at changing that schedule and maybe only doing 2 meetings a month when we're in the heart of allocation of resources leading up to approval and or development of our approval and adoption of our budget. And then at the end of the year, that work leads to drafting the updates to the strategic financial plan that's presented to the board for adoption in each June. And then in addition to part of that steering committee is a smaller group that meets weekly, and that includes Dr. Riki Smith, myself, and Paul and others from our finance and data staff. And so we're having conversations each Monday morning, and we may have guests come, whether it's cabinet members or department heads that have their own programs or investments that they want to propose. And so that's the starting point, that small group. And we can help with any type of cost and student data that the department or the cabinet member needs to help evaluate help develop measurements and outcomes in a budget for their program. We included as an additional item in the packet what's called a project outline. And this is the first step with a proposal of a program investment. This example is middle school AVID that was done a couple years ago, and it shows up as I believe, under college and career in the framework of the current strategic financial plan. And so we actually made some investments in the current year using ESSER dollars as part of this proposal. And so there's several sections that the director and their staff would fill out to identify their project outline and how it might lead to a academic return on investment measurement, starting off with a description and theory of action in the first section, and then perhaps what the evidence and research is. Most of the proposals, we want to see them as research-based. So what is for instance, in this case, what are the national statistics when it comes to AVID students and success in school and secondary education, post-secondary education? Student impact. So we want to hear what the student impact is on the proposed investment. Who's going to lead the project, the leadership and participation, and description of the impact as far as how it impacted student growth and achievement, action plan, what's it going to take to put the plan in place, and then measurement and outcome plan. This is where Paul and his team come in, and then a timeline, communication plan, and of course a budget. And then when the proposal's first made, of course, there wouldn't be an academic return on investment calculation. They could propose how it's going to be perhaps calculated if it's relevant. And then the ask is that there be regular updates given to cabinet on the program. So that's another example of the work that the strategic financial plan steering committee does, and then the weekly working group. The other impact of that committee is we convene a community budget work group each winter, early spring. And that can be anywhere from the timeline of January to April, depending on the level of content and agenda items. But that the steering committee helps formulate those agendas and presentations for that process. And the work group hears any proposals, new proposals as far as investments, and then updates to prior year and ongoing investments. And then also, depending on the timing of things and the other content that we need to share with them, we also ask them to give input to the update to the annual update to the strategic financial plan. And of course, the thing that's I think really made a difference the last couple of years is we've with Zinnia on the director of equity and inclusion, we've added her to the steering committee, so we have a very high level equity tone to the work we do. For obvious reasons, but we're intentional about it, and we use a lot of those protocols that she's implemented in the district as part of this community budget work group process. And then moving into the completion of the community work group process, that ends with some recommendations based on the presentations that the work group has heard from staff and directors. And we're at that point where we need to come up with a balanced budget. And if we determine there's room in the budget, whether it's general fund resources or new resources like SIA or ESSER, then it's up to cabinet and the finance team to put together that balanced budget so we can submit that to the budget committee in May. And so the further right we go on this diagram, the more formal the process goes, because the budget committee has a lot of state laws that apply called local budget law. So it's requires the ability to have a forum for public comment in the budget committee, and then making sure the budget committee is advertised, and then the budget committee ends their work with approval of the budget document, whether it's as presented or amended. And then in June, the board would consider adoption of the budget for the ensuing year. So this was an attempt to tie together our work during the year when it comes to making decisions about allocation of resources and measuring what we're doing, and then using that to help inform our budget decisions that we make at the end of the year for the next year. Yep.
So in addition to reporting back to the steering committee about the success, the ROI basically on a program, the board also has in the past asked specifically when certain new items are in the budget, we'd like a report back to the board on the efficacy of this in 3 months, 6 months, whatever. So that's also something the board has discretion with.
So I think, hello, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I think understanding the process and how it all worked and what the system was that sort of supported all of this, I think is important for us in terms of having that contextual sort of historical understanding. But I think we're still really curious about outcomes, like specific outcomes as they relate to the specific goals. And I think you've clarified, for at least for me, and I think sort of what the process is in terms of how you get to that place. But I was hoping for some discussion about data, about outcomes, about sort of where we are with respect to achieving some of the goals as they relate to the current strategic plan.
So there are a number of documents we can probably provide. One is our the quarterly SIP report, which takes those measurements that are called out in the strategic plan. And Paul, we can certainly bundle those documents up for you. We'll give you access. The board has had access previously. They're tied to the school SIPs. So these are the student achievement and other measures. In addition, each year at the end of the strategic plan and the board review, there is a report relative to where those programs and the AROI that you have here is embedded. So if you were to look under section 1 of the strategic plan for the 2021 school year, you would see a column relative to outcomes for that year. And so each year, the strategic plan, those measures, we spend a great deal of time preparing for that final report that then outlines how those measures, is it strategic plan or strategic financial plan? David, I'm trying to think where we put those measures. It's in the strategic financial plan. Yeah, so they will have measures to that. So those are two places that we can certainly point you and give you that data. It goes on for pages. So in order for brevity this evening, knowing we had 2 hours, but it is available there, and we can certainly at a next work session go back over and answer any questions you have related to those. One of the things that are top of mind for me are relative to the investments that we have made in the iReady assessment suites. This would be right for AROI process, and certainly as part of the academic outcomes cornerstone, to be able to say, did we hit that 5 or 8%? How did this investment play? And I think the key relative to these investments, and David has said it many times, it isn't what was the most inexpensive way to get there. It is what was the most efficient and effective outcome. For instance, there is an example relative to SQUAD, which was used at the 9th grade level in terms of transition. It was probably far more expensive on the face of it in terms of per student cost, and yet it was incredibly more effective because of that cost. So what it demonstrates is that the cost was well worth the outcome in terms of student outcomes and holding on to students and making sure that they transitioned effectively into 9th grade with and attained the credits that they needed to be on track for graduation. So we can provide those documents. Paul, can you think of anything else that we're missing?
All right. Hello? Oh, it's working? Okay. So the strategic financial plan that you have linked in the documents, actually at the bottom of them, there are links within links. So you have access to them right now, number one. Oh, there it is. The second thing is the SIP, the Continuous Improvement Plan reports, which we're happy to give. And then the June 28th board packet, I believe, has the final end of year report from last year.
Thank you.
Patty, that might be it, but any other questions?
Yeah, I think we're thinking that maybe what the board might need to do for homework is to look at that report that you mentioned, the June 28th report, because that gives us a sense of kind of how things went, so to speak.
And on the 18th, the board will also, in our work session there, you'll receive an update relative to first quarter data for this year. We'll be presenting to you the dashboards for both the district as well as for individual schools relative to academic outcomes. And so I think that will be another piece. Then you can make a decision as you're thinking about what kinds of reports that we want, you may want relative to the strategic plan. I would certainly offer that. I think that there are some pieces of measurement, i.e. the ACT and others that perhaps have not been as granular as we needed them to be. And so I will probably provide you with some side commentary about perhaps, along with Paul's support, perhaps not this measurement, but this one, because it's more granular. And that's the reason why you hear me speak, effusively about iReady, because it is so granular and we can look literally student by student, as well as collectively across grade bands.
That sounds great. And I think also in terms of sort of those anecdotal pieces too, just having the context around some of that, because data is great. But that context piece for that is really helpful. So I appreciate putting, those, getting us kind of access to those things. And I think to what Vice Chair Lynn was saying, I think what we can do, this is very helpful, especially kind of seeing what it looks like year over year in terms of the actual month by month process and the different groups and stakeholders involved. So that's critical to be able to overlay that into our strategic planning process, as well as the equity audit piece that we were going to also overlay. We're going to have a very layered situation. And so I do agree that we continue kind of thinking about the outcomes, how we want to kind of keep compartmentalizing them, perhaps in those equity pillars. And we can kind of talk about that piece later today too. But I do think next time we meet, it would be helpful to kind of come to the table with an understanding of what outcomes we have seen, and then how we want to work ones that maybe are really successful and continue that, or ones that need some tweaking or shifting, or new data protocols to kind of find that granular data. That's something that we can really sort of nail down next time. That seem appropriate? Okay. Any other questions from board members? All right, and then with that, if there are no questions, then Director Moore, you can move right on into so the next thing we wanted to talk about is or have someone else talk about that has all the experience, is the process for getting that request for proposal for that facilitator for the strategic plan process. And so that's the next agenda item.
So what we did is put together a proposed schedule, not to limit it to the RFP process, but some of the milestone dates throughout the whole year, leading into next fall. And so as far as our community work group, this past Monday, we wanted to, as part of those milestones, wanted to identify when some of that student data would be available, both quantitative and qualitative. So right now, and I think Dr. Sue mentioned it, we have data available that will be shared next Monday evening. And so I have, at the beginning of this timeline, I have two sets of dates, because initially I was hopeful that our RFP process could start a little later, for selfish reasons only. But we have our auditors coming next week, so we've been focused on that. But the ideal date to release an RFP is probably next week, early next week. That would allow the RFP to be out there, whether we're sending that request for proposal to specific individuals or firms. And then we can also advertise it out to whoever wishes to respond to the scope of work. And then if we started it that quick, we can make, as a minimum, an RFP needs to be out on the street 7 days. We usually like to go at least 14 days because it allows time for the proposers to answer the request for proposal and put a proposal together. And so that means it would become due the first part of November. And then that would allow, give us a few weeks to have a committee that evaluates the proposals and then bring a recommendation to the board to award a contract on November 22nd. That way, you have the month of December to start convening with the facilitator. And because as part of our conversations in our Monday meeting, we talked about trying not to overlap the strategic plan process too much with the community budget process. So if we hit the ground running, perhaps in January and February with the beginning the development of the strategic plan, and then that would give us at the beginning of the spring, March and April, to do our community budget process. Question? Right.
One question on the data front. So there's data mentioned in December 13th, and then an update on quantitative data in February of 22. Would there be, so the end of the year data, once we have more student outcome data, will that come too late to be part of this process?
Yes, simply because of the assessment window that we have established. So we will have two sets of data, fall and winter. You will also have, and that's this calendar that you see in front of you here, as well as qualitative data. Paul is going to share some work on Monday that he and Director Carol Kinch are doing in terms of a student survey that will be administered several times during the year. The challenge is, remind me, Paul, relative to the close of I want to say it's in May. It's the last iReady window closes May.
Yeah, it closes in late May.
Okay, so late May. And so the problem then, well, not problem, but then the process is Paul and team have to take that and clean it up, make sure we've got all the pieces together. So that data won't come out until June. And you can see here that just as an example, October 18th, we have clean data set for fall, but that window closed probably the first week in end of September, first week in October. It takes that amount of time to make sure that all the data is accurate and clean. So that becomes the challenge here too, the process.
So for things we don't have measures for the current academic year, we'll revert to previous academic measures as we're building the future.
Potentially, yes. And I think it all depends on what you as a board decide that you want to, how you want to, what you want to measure and how you want to measure it.
For sure. Okay. Thank you.
Just with the caveat that as you all, those board members that were here last year, the data from last year was heavily asterisked in all places. So as we're using previous data, just to understand that feature of the data.
I remember too, we talked about extending the kind of final presentation of the plan to September because we might have the opportunity to look at some data over the summer, right? And that while there might be a draft of the plan developed, that whatever we see in the data might impact the final outcome of the strategic plan is something I remember talking about.
I just want to clarify because that's really helpful. So what we could do is, because I'm also acknowledging we want to try to keep a line between our strategic planning and our budget processes. So basically we would go through our initial strategic planning process, build a framework, transition into a framework and even a first draft potentially, move into budget season. Following budget season, hopefully shortly thereafter, we'll have the data. We can, over the summer, convene a work session or two, reopen the plan, and update it for approval in the fall. Okay. For sure. Yep. This is a good discussion. Thank you.
I mean, at any point, we're going to have data in sort of suspension. And so at some point, we just have to decide the data we've got is the data we've got, and we make the plan based on that. The thing about our strategic plans, it's not static. And so we always are looking at it every year. So it's really just a matter of picking what our deadline point is and kind of keeping that consistent.
But
year over year.
we don't have any good data right
But
now, going back 3 years or something.
Right. And so it's, for this year, we're not going to have a good data point to compare it to for the previous year and part of even, the year before. So we know it's going to be messy the first year. It'll get better the second year of the strategic plan and the third, and hopefully by the time we're midway through, we're smooth sailing and we're sort of not on autopilot. We know what we're looking at.
One of the pieces that we have been discussing at the cabinet level this week is, particularly with the high school metrics, is the fact that really the 18-19 school year was the last time we really had a clean slate. In the sense of directives from the state as to what had to be measured, what goals and requirements were particularly for high school students. And so the decision has been made, and you will see that when you start to review the SIPs at the high school level, that we are anchoring into 18-19 as the last base year. We're going to kind of give a wink and a nod, if you will, to 1920 and 2021, simply because of the impacts of the pandemic, and shoot to their goals are then measured off of how to get back to the 18-19 data and then grow from there. And I think that makes the most sense. It is the cleanest. It is the 18-19 requirements are the same as they will. 21-22 requirements from the state are the same as they were in 18-19. Versus all of the waivers and patchwork that the state helped us with when we were mostly online for that period of time. So I would offer that that is our recommendation to the board as to how we might start reestablishing that baseline.
So how does that mesh with your vision? Does that align?
No, thanks for the reminder about COVID and data collection kind of stopped, right? I mean, right, yeah. We'll use what we have to try to learn as much as we can.
And in addition to that, I had just sort of piecemealed together a draft timeline just for kind of Marvin and I to take a look at. And actually the dates, it's like you read my mind or the document, but most of those fell really nicely because I had sort of that November 22nd date pinned for kind of sharing whatever consultant information we chose. I had September 1st, as we talked about last time, as potentially kind of having our new plan go into effect, which gave us that summer to kind of work on edits and perhaps new data. So I think plugging in some of the data point dates that you had in there. And again, this was a draft calendar, so it wasn't something we were talking about today, but it helps me feel like we were on a good track to kind of being able to get an RFP, to get those stakeholder groups ready and kind of have this work done in a way that makes sense and that feels effective and kind of finding authentic data.
Yeah, one area where I'll need support in, and I know we had an introductory conversation between Chair Bowman, Vice Chair Lynn, and Dr. Reiki Smith and myself a couple weeks ago, is we need to the RFP needs to include a focused scope of work. And I'm not the technical writer when it comes to this type of work. Dr. Ricky Smith did a great job of verbalizing it in our meeting. I wrote some notes about a storybook, and then one thing to consider, and you guys can help, everyone could help with this, is, and a good example of it is in the board packet for next Monday. We have our contract recommendation for the fundraiser vendor RFP, and I put the scope of the work in the board memo for that particular thing, and then an attached document as an evaluation worksheet. So we need to know what the scope of work is for this individual or firm, and then we need to know how we're going to evaluate them when it comes to receiving our proposal. But you can kind of see a framework from if you use the fundraiser RFP as an example. I can put together all of the other legal part of the request for a proposal, but the person who's going to be proposing, they're going to want to know, what am I supposed to do for the school district? So
is that something that Vice Chair Lynn and Director Irvin can do in a subcommittee, or is that a full board work session sort of?
the only thing is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a quick turnaround with the earlier schedule. It all depends too on whether we talked about some individuals or groups that may be willing to do the work. If we want to just limit, we don't have to, this isn't something we have to advertise for the whole world. If we have, 2 or 3 or 2 to 4 that we're comfortable with, then we could just, it would maybe shrink our timeline a little bit at the front end at least.
Are you both comfortable kind of making those calls and huddling with Dr. Sue to design the components? Yeah, in the next 10 minutes.
At some point, there was a document or draft or something. Maybe it was from the previous RFP that maybe was shared, where it looked like there was some language. Was that the Hillsborough?
Was that the Hillsborough
Maybe
example?
it was. Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
so we could work from that. And again, as David has shared with you here, the RFP relative to vendors for fundraising is an excellent example as well.
Yeah, I think it would be, I haven't looked at the Hillsborough one, but at least from organizing the scope of work and the evaluation, I would like to stay with the framework of the one we just did for the fundraiser, because that's been recently reviewed as far as statutes are concerned by the attorney, because each legislative session they update public contracting law. I feel good about that one being up to date on the legal side of things.
So that RFP you're talking about has not yet, that board packet has not yet been published, correct? So that's something that Dr. Ricky Smith would need to share with our team along with the Hillsborough RFP, and maybe between those 2 documents, you can work something out.
Any other questions on RFP process timeline? I'm going to recommend we take a 3-minute recess for a quick break. People can grab some refreshments, and then we'll go back to you two for the final 2 items, if that works for folks. Okay, 3-minute recess.
Oh, she did.
I will call the meeting back to order at 6:12 p.m. and hand it back over to Vice Chair Lynn and Director Irvin.
Okay. So Dr. Sue and Director Moore and Director Trist and Irvin and I will be having further conversation about the RFP process and should have a draft of something to present to the board shortly. So thank you. Thank you for that. The other thing that we wanted to talk about tonight was the theory of action. And there's a draft of the current version of the theory of action in the board packet on page 27. But then there's also a draft of a new version that we wrote that we think could also be considered by this board. Should I read it? What's the best way to? Okay. So the current version says, if we work in collective community with high expectations and a belief in all students, use culturally responsive instruction and hire support and retain talented staff as catalysts for learning, then we create a nurturing school community where every individual student feels safe, valued, and responsibly prepared for success in a rapidly changing world. And we thought that this theory of action was really awesome. And it also sort of described the sort of overall kind of theory of action, it seems, for the district and what the expectations and outcomes would be for student learning. This particular draft that we're proposing tonight is more narrowed and focused on the strategic planning effort itself, and is intended to serve more so as a guide for our work as a group. So it reads, as equity-minded, student and community-centered leaders who are focused on advancing high achievement for all students, we will develop an inclusive strategic planning process that clarifies the district's equity-focused mission and vision that will result in significantly improved academic outcomes for all students. So again, the idea is to focus on the committee and the work.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of call out that piece. So typically, I think when we were looking at different theory of actions, it's about the document, the actual strategic plan. And what this is really, and what Vice Chair Lynn said, is that this is really our theory of action regarding to the process of really creating this and future strategic plans. And so our hope is that that becomes sort of a guidepost for not just this strategic plan, but in theory, the next one. And as we have change in our board, this could still serve as a way to kind of look at how we build those future strategic plans instead of a theory of action for this strategic plan, and then a theory of action that could drastically change for 2 strategic plans from now. So kind of hoping that there was some longevity kind of that we could thread through multiple strategic plans, which is why we focused on the process rather than the plan. So are there thoughts, first thoughts on the read?
So I love what you've got here. My only concern is it's not a theory of action. A theory of action is an if we do blah, 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 then this will be the outcome. So if we can just reshape it a little bit so that it's an if then, so it's a theory of action. And I think it'd be really easy to do. Like if we, as equity-minded, student and community-centered leaders who are focused on advancing high achievement for all students, develop an inclusive strategic planning process that clarifies the district's equity-focused mission and vision, then we will see, or we will have results. We will have significantly improved academic outcomes for students, something like that, just so that it's a more traditional form. But I love the.
Thank you. That was a good note. Anything else?
I was trying to remember where and how the previous theory of action ties into the larger strategic plan. Because it does, so the old strategic, or the old theory of action, I don't remember if that came first and then the plan happened, or if it was all together. So is the thinking that after the strategic planning process, or during the strategic planning process, perhaps we would create a theory of action sort of that applies broadly to the district, as like part of the sort of mission, vision, theory of action? Or I agree with Director Zershman. I like what you have. I'm just curious if you thought of a broader version of it for the full district.
Created not just for the strategic plan, which is part of what was actually in your slides earlier, that relates to kind of the 4 pillars and then the priorities as it relates to all of that, which this would be then separate from.
The reason for that with that document was that we did not have a theory of action with the current strategic plan. So as we were headed in to the Student Success Act, and again, because we were working with the DM group, and one of the things that they said is that your strategic plan should have a clear theory of action. Why did you choose these pillars in essence? And I have to share with you that we have a little bit of ownership. David and I, we ground through 3 very long days of conversation with cabinet members getting to that statement, because everyone had a little slightly different viewpoint and take. And just when we thought we had them perched by Friday, they went off the rails. And David looked at me and he says, "You're never going to get this." And I said, "Just be patient. I'm not giving up yet." And so to Director Bowman's, Chair Bowman's point, it is meant to be an overarching statement for the entire document, why it exists. In your case, what I love about the theory of action here is that this is an additional theory of action, and you can certainly have one that is broad and then one that's very specific to process. And I think that's what I see the opportunity here being. So the question will be, once the strategic plan is that you all will adopt is completed, we will want to go back to that first overarching and say, does this still fit? If it doesn't, then we need to revise that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I really like that plan of thinking about this theory of action as really guiding the work of the process of strategic planning, and then keeping the overarching theory of action and then revisiting it once we have gotten to a point of completion. I want to just read back the version that I tried to craft based on Jill and Ben's feedback. It says, if we as equity-minded and community-centered leaders who are focused on advancing high achievement for all students develop an inclusive strategic planning process that clarifies the district's equity-focused mission and vision, then this will result in significantly improved academic outcomes for all students. Okay. Other feedback?
Oh. So I like it. I don't know about results in significantly improved academic outcomes for all students. Just because I don't know, depending on what we're looking at, right? I mean, are we looking at, like graduation rates? Are we looking at that, right? We've got pretty good graduation rates. We've got pretty good, if you look at the dashboard, the data is looking good. Obviously, we can always improve, right? But how would we measure what significantly improved means versus what we already are doing for our students? Are we talking about like significant decrease of the opportunity gap, or are we talking about, you know, how can we measure significant outcomes for all of our students when some of our students are already doing great and some need to be brought up more? Like, are we talking about equitable outcomes for all students? Then maybe that might be a different way of.
Or kind of like something around like continually improve. So something where there's continued growth,
Yes,
like equitable.
but
growth.
equitable, because some students are
Yes,
already like
absolutely.
overachieving,
What is
right?
significant?
Yes.
So David, if we replaced significantly improved with equitable outcomes for all students, would that?
Yeah.
Okay. Because your question also leads me to think, and I thought about this too. I think we both thought about this, whether or not really the focus is on eliminating gaps, right, in achievement, and if the statement should be really positioned in that way. And I think your comment about equitable outcomes sort of suggests that in a way. Do you?
I would just real quick, I would ask if we could do a both and approach, similar to the way that Dr. Ricky Smith formats her superintendent goals of growth for all students and particular and even larger growth for historically marginalized students. And the reason I say that is because we do have a legal obligation to serve the talented and gifted students and provide them a high quality education that helps them grow too, and improve too. So if we could incorporate both, I think that would make it strong. But Dr. Ricky Smith.
You just demonstrated that you and I have been working together long enough. You already read my mind. That's exactly right. I think it is because, and I've shared with previous, and I will share with you. One of the first things I always do when I come into a district is I take a look at the whole data set. And what always follows a pattern is that not only are there gaps relative to historically underserved, but there's underachievement relative to TAG. And same issue here. And so, yes, I'm urging us to think both and that it is simply because, and we had this conversation yesterday with our TTEA leaders, simply because a student has achieved an A does not mean that we stop instructing. It means that we continue to push to the next goal. And that is the expectation.
Right.
I love that
and-
Mahathi laughed at that.
Right, and then that's where the equitable outcomes for all comes into play, because if we are providing equitable instruction, then we are providing our TAG students with what they need to achieve, right? And we're providing our marginalized students with what they need to achieve, and so we're educating all, and we're all giving them equitable amounts. It's not like we're saying, no, you're good, we're gonna forget you, right? It's like that's where the equitable piece comes into play.
So equitable captures both and. Okay. And Jill, do you want to comment before we? Okay, go ahead.
So that last little piece is getting kind of mushy, because one of the things I'm looking at is I'm seeing now we've got equity. If we add it there in the then statement, we've now got equity 3 times in one statement, in one sentence. So we probably don't need it 3 times. I'm thinking probably 2 times is going to be enough. So I don't know if we want to. When the same word appears 3 times in one sentence, the editor in me goes. So what if we changed it at the end after the district's mission and vision? So we clarify the district's mission and vision. We take out the equity focus there. Then academic outcomes will improve equitably for all students.
I have an alternative that I think gets to where you're going, but actually,
Okay.
this is Dr. Sue's language or something close to it. You'd keep it. You'd say will result in significantly improved academic outcomes for all students and a closure of the achievement gap, or something where we're saying everyone goes up, but greater academic progress for historically marginalized students.
That works too.
Or do you remember your terminology of how you use that? It's somewhere.
Would it be too bold to say the elimination of education disparities or disparities in achievement and attainment?
The purpose of a theory of action is to set not just, it's literally to set audacious goals. Where do we want to be? Okay. And they're audacious, not only in, they are meant to provoke thinking and thought on the part of the community, but it's also audacious in the sense of provoking and supporting action to achieve that. And we all know that, and I certainly have known this as an educator, and I'm certain for the educators in this room, they know this too. If you set the bar here, they'll hit just a little bit below it. Better that you set it here and work like crazy to get them there. That's how you achieve audacious goals. They can be achieved. So I would really encourage you all to think in that manner.
It's okay. So here's the latest version. If we, as equity-minded, student and community-centered leaders who are focused on advancing high achievement for all students, develop an inclusive strategic planning process that clarifies the district's equity-focused mission and vision, then this will result in significantly improved academic outcomes for all students and eliminate disparities in academic achievement and attainment.
Only other thing coming to mind is whether or not, and I want to caveat this by saying I don't necessarily, this is just something that popped in my head. It's very narrowly focused on academic outcomes right now, which I think is appropriate for our mission as a district. But we've also, over the last several years, broadened our focus to be thinking about the full student experience relative to bullying and harassment, social emotional learning, mental health. So maybe this isn't the place for that. I'm not suggesting that it has to go in, but just as a curiosity, wondering what other folks think about that.
And I would say, I think that is a great conversation piece when we kind of start talking about, are we going to use the 4 pillars? What are those outcomes that we've seen? What do we want to change? What do we want to add? Because I think you're right, when we have, culture and climate, and we have staff, and we have these very clear buckets that we want to fill with really important goals and then outcomes. That isn't just, I guess the theory is that all of those things in cohesion make for the academic outcome and that achievement. But I also think that it's okay to say specifically, kind of like equity, where we infuse it with everything, but we also are going to point it out specifically. And I think also mental health and that social emotional learning piece, we're going to infuse it with everything, but maybe there are important pieces that we say specifically, as well as sort of acknowledging that it's within everything that we do.
So is there a specific
Sue is recommending the terminology students feeling safe and valued. If there's a place to. Yep. What do you? I kind of like that. What do you all think? Because then we could, then theoretically we're talking about discipline, we're talking about bullying, harassment, we're talking about athletics participation, extracurricular involvement.
Yeah, I'll take a real quick look at the educational equity policy that the board has adopted, and because I think you're really hooking right back into that, and it would be really smart to have that clear tie of your theory of action to that plan in terms of its implementation through the strategic plan.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think this is a little flavor of what the strategic planning process is. So I think we're probably, unless there's more discussion on this, Dr. Ricky Smith's going to look that up and consider language. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go with this version for now, and then we'll send this to you, Patty, so you have the updated language and you can send out. Okay.
All right. So the last thing we wanted to do this evening is kind of give you a quick framework or sort of list of who we have sort of broadly identified as people that we think should be stakeholders in the kind of conversation around the strategic plan when that committee gets formed. And I know that it should stay somewhat small. That being said, we had a lot of really good ideas about who should be part of that. So quickly, we'll kind of go through what we thought. And again, these are not specific people in some of these categories yet, but just people that we thought would be interesting and important voices to have as part of this conversation. And we can just talk about that. You can give us your feedback. So we have the internal team, which would be the board, the superintendent, CFO, Tracy, assistant superintendent for instruction, HR, TTEA reps for both classified and licensed. We would like a couple of students, a couple of parents. We also thought that Zinnia Un would be a really great person to have, or someone from her diversity, equity, inclusion team. And then we really kind of started to think about the greater community. And we thought of a Tigard chamber member, a Tualatin city council member, perhaps the King City mayor or city council member, some one or two representatives from our culturally responsive partners that we work with at the district level. And then in terms of parents and students, we really thought with high school representation, parents and or students from each of the 3 high schools. So that ended up being probably bigger than 15 people. But those were just people that kind of came to mind as voices that might be neat and thoughtful and important to the conversation. So I will open it up to.
I want to say one thing in addition to that, just as a sort of preamble, and then we'll go. When we ran for these positions, and I think we all had this experience of dealing with these various constituencies out there, right, who are supportive or not for one reason or another. And I think that as I thought about these various groups that are out there, and I thought about how much I've engaged them, and I thought, oh, very little. And so I feel like this is an opportunity for that broad sort of community engagement. And so maybe it opens things up a bit more than we originally thought. But I think that engagement is necessary because it is difficult to do that level of engagement, on a consistent basis without some kind of process like this.
Oh, I was just curious where the 15 people number came from. Is that just like something that is standard, or is it just like?
It usually works arbitrary. I mean, not arbitrary.
Because personally, it like feels small if we're considering like so many different groups, and I I'm assuming we're not just picking one person from each of those groups, like maybe from like one city councilor, but I don't think you're just gonna pick one student or one parent because they're not like representative of like a bigger. So I think it might be valuable to broaden that. Which sounds like you guys are already gonna do.
Yeah, and I think part of what ends up happening is it's really tricky to schedule and get everybody in meetings to do the work sessions. And so I think that's why when you have the voices are all really important, but that number kind of ends up being what kind of works well to get a group of people in one place at the same time together. Now, certainly, there could be people that come to some and can't come to others, and we can kind of determine that like we did with the SSA product, all that work. But that I think was where that number sort of rests easily. But again, like you said, you're right, like one or two students from a district this big doesn't seem very representative. And, ages would be really neat. Like what do middle schoolers think, and what are kinder parents wondering versus parents of seniors and at the different level. So I think there's a lot there, but then how, logistically, how do we get 50 people doing that work? So then it's kind of where do we meet in the middle that feels like everyone has a seat at the table, but then we also can actually have everybody sitting at the table.
I know it's kind of like a logistical nightmare, but does like making it like committees. So like if there was, let's say 15 people that had to be like a part of this group that met regularly, what if like each of those people were like responsible for, I don't know, getting a feel for like members of like their community and like how they felt. I don't know, just an idea. And I guess we don't have to get into that right now, but yeah.
I'm actually looking at I scrolled down the list as you were reading off, and it strikes me that it's actually administrative heavy. And I'm wondering if maybe we want to take a few of the administrators off of the team, because you mentioned superintendent, CFO, assistant superintendent, HR, equity director, and communications. That's a lot of administrators. And so it might be that we can make it more like 3 instead of 6 administrators, and then that helps elevate the voice of students without having to bring on as many people overall into the group. But I want to make sure that the administration thinks that that's a good idea too.
One idea could be to have the administrators, or at least the extended, you're talking about a large group and facilitation. The administrators could help facilitate smaller groups.
Or even have cabinet there, or student cabinet there as, you could call them ex officio if you wanted, but I do think their expertise is going to be
Right.
valuable to be in the room.
Right, to sort of weigh in, but not necessarily to be doing the making of the sausage.
So just to clarify, so cabinet would attend strategic planning committee meetings, but not necessarily be all on the committee.
Yeah, I was gonna say, again, Vice Chair, the cabinet will serve as technical support in terms of gathering information or data or other expertise that you may need. So, that's true regardless of what the board, processes are. So I would probably sit on the committee with you, obviously, but there may, and Director Moore may, or some others, but then the rest would serve as technical advice.
I think that's a good compromise. But I also like what Mahathi was saying about greater representation of parents and students and community members, because we were thinking, I think, along those lines too.
I have a question about the bringing in the council people and the mayors. Are those nonpartisan positions? Yes. Okay. Just wanted to make sure that I that we clarify that because, maybe the broader public doesn't know that and they feel like we're bringing in more, liberal versus Republican. So I just want to make sure that was addressed.
Yeah, I think if we are inclusive in terms of the communities that we serve, and we're likely to get a broader political, spectrum, I think, at the table. But if we,
And what's true is whoever is coming to that table will then be engaging in equity work, which is would be really interesting, and I think in some ways eye-opening or helpful, or just kind of broadening in terms of some understanding of what equity work is. Because although we're doing a strategic plan, like we've all talked about, it's both pinpointing and infusing equity in all of those things that we're doing. And so I think that would be an opportunity if people stuck with the work that maybe had a different perspective on what equity work looked like, to really see what it is too. So I think, and to your point, David, I think, yeah, we can just say we want Tigard or, the city leaders or community leaders kind of as part of that, and can always clarify that these are sort of, if people wanted to join, maybe there would be no interest, but that those would be nonpartisan sort of committee members.
Yeah, and then we also have to remember what are our demographics that we serve in the district, and if we have an accurate representation of those demographics when we're looking at the committee, whether it be people that identify as LGBTQ or people who identify as Latinx, Black, all those BIPOC people. So just making sure that is addressed in the committee.
Yeah, I really like the direction you're going. I appreciate Director Jaime's bringing up the piece about city partners. I do, we work with our city partners quite a bit, actually. And I actually think I remember even Mayor Sherrod of Durham, who participated in our March 2020 meeting about, and so I think to your point, Marvin, I think that's really smart for us to be thinking of this as a relationship building opportunity as well as a strategic planning process. And I'm starting to be convinced that maybe we do need to look at a larger number than we had originally discussed, which is more in line with what the previous 5 year strategic planning process is. One of those committee members, there was like 50, and they'd all go into the library. But if you didn't show up for one, no one would notice. You'd get the notes and you'd be able to get caught up, but it wouldn't stop the ability of the committee to function. And there wouldn't be a fear of like, oh, that group isn't represented, because there was going to be one or two or three others who would have a similar perspective. So yeah, exactly. Similar to SSA. So I'm not sure what that means in terms of official composition or how we design that piece of it, but I do think, and I guess the other question is, were you all imagining full virtual for this, or were you imagining hybrid or in person?
we hadn't thought about it, to be honest with you. But when I think about an effective, impactful strategic planning process, I do have a bit of a difficult time imagining it in the virtual context. My suggestion would be that we try to figure out how to do it in person, and if it means masking up and social distancing, that'd be my preference, but I certainly would be open to suggestion.
No, I think what we, again, we just have to be mindful relative to doing the distancing as we're demonstrating here. But that certainly can be done. It's, the good news is that we certainly either have this space, or we certainly will soon have the Calapooya Training Center, which seats 300. So we would have plenty of space to stretch, distance people appropriately. And still do the work, because I agree with you, Vice Chair, that this is the kind of work you want to do sitting as close to knee as you can, which in this case is about 6 feet. And I also appreciate the fact that the continuity relative to our city partners. We've worked hard during, I know prior to my tenure, that was the case. I worked hard to maintain that. And I know that our partners appreciate that. And it also, I think, in many cases informs the work that they do as mayors within their community, and they feel a closer tie to this work in the community. And so certainly, I think we could run a process. I'm sitting, David, thinking about our SSA process. In some cases, on some of those evenings, we had well over 50, sometimes 60 people. I was thinking about the one at CFT. That was a packed room, and we had translation, and we had our Latinx community was very well represented that evening. I remember specifically, we had childcare. So I think those are some of the things you want to think about as well for this committee. If we want to go big, that, these are some other pieces that we would want to layer into that, so that parents would feel that they could come, leave their young ones and be watched while we do the work.
I can't recall. On your list, did you have schools foundation and or PSOs? That might be another one.
I do not think so. Yeah, we're going to add that. Yeah. We did have chamber, but we didn't have foundation.
One of the nice things too is as you get some of these, you'll find that there's some overlap, right? Somebody will be on the foundation and they're also a parent of a, kindergartner, and then somebody else who's on the chamber, is also married to a teacher or something like that. So there, you do get some overlap, so you don't have to have 100 people. But so if we're talking about a big committee of 60, I'm assuming that committee of 60 is not going to be writing the plan, writing the actual plan. They're going to be doing the brainstorming and the okay, good, the structure.
See how they inform that.
I don't, even with all the folks that Mahati and Tristan and I are talking about, I didn't see it as getting to 60, maybe 25.
And depending on the 100 people that you get. Oh, no, wait. I was also going to say that I think both cities have community liaisons that you can tap into as well. That we've got, and I believe there's some that are just like liaison to the Latinx population, and I think they might have various liaisons, right? And so you can partner with them as well to get people that belong to marginalized communities.
Martha Graff, one of ours was Tigard. That's one of ours.
Oh, well, that's for the district. I'm saying the city.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, but yes,
Part of the city. Oh, okay. That's a great idea.
I know Betsy Ruff, I think, is her last name for Tualatin.
These microphones. If we can't get the city liaison for Latinx community, then we just make an extra effort to make sure we get students from, say, the Mecha club at that school, so that that community is in at least some way represented. So there are various ways that we can reach out to all of the various.
Is there other feedback? So we have recorded those suggestions, and great suggestions. I think we'll come up with another plan and present that again. Yeah.
So
Great.
what are the next steps? Do we could this be a revision of these plans be brought to a report and discussion? Is that kind of what we're thinking is the next step, or do you think we need another work session?
For the community piece specifically, the committee piece?
For the whole strategic planning process, what do you need next from the board to move it forward?
Do we want to have at a board meeting, do we want and need to vote, I would imagine, on the theory of action? Do we want, no? Just agree to it? Okay. So we can present sort of a final draft of the theory of action. We can present sort of a second draft, perhaps final draft of a committee composition list for your review. And then we'll be working on the RFP. But that's not necessarily board required action.
Not necessarily. So we might not need action from the board then in the next short time frame. But Dr. Sue was mentioning we do have a November 8th as a potential work session, if you think that that would be useful for your process.
I think when we vote on the RFP, we can at that point amend it if we need to. And so that can be the point at which the board is essentially approving both the RFP and the process moving forward on it. Doesn't that make sense? That way we don't need to vote on it before you send it out.
So maybe it does make sense, Director Bowman, to have Chair Bowman to have another work session to approve the RFP and the committee composition plan. And
We could do that in a board meeting,
okay,
unless you want an extended period of time for another discussion.
no,
We've had our chance to weigh in.
did I say that too quickly?
Yeah, then I think whenever the RFP is ready, it just you can bring it to exec and we'll put it on when probably the nearest board meeting we can to get it rolling.
Sounds good.
For the process for getting committee members, are you just going to put out an all call, or are you going to do a directed sort of shoulder tapping of individuals?
We want to make sure we're reaching all the communities, and so calling on some of the people that we know that might have people that they know of that are interested from different communities as well, and kind of talking to our culturally responsive partners, and also shoulder tapping people that we know that might be a good fit. But I think kind of getting out as many networking circles beyond our own would be, I think, best practice.
What do you think about maybe soliciting specific nominations for individuals who kind of fit the categories that we've all talked about tonight? And would it be appropriate for individual board members as well as staff to then send nominations to us? Would we that we could consider and putting together a list of actual individuals?
I don't know if board members could, but staff could. Trying to think through.
Wouldn't it be like more equitable to just put out an all call, and then
Yeah.
if you don't get the desired diversity, and then shoulder tap?
Yeah. And Director Jaime is spot on. I'm thinking like with the SSA process, we did an all call, but we used our basic needs teams, our FPAs. Instead, reach out. Well, maybe not. Reach out to our specific communities to make sure that they were, number one, aware, and number two, understood. And that's what I'm saying. I can think of several nights when we had the SSA sessions where more were able to come and others weren't, but everyone was represented. And with our community partners, we typically push out an all call there as well. Sometimes they'll send the city managers, sometimes the mayors themselves will come, sometimes it's city council members. But we leave it open to them, but we would like to have you represented and someone will answer that call. So that would be the process that I would offer to you that I think has borne pretty good fruit in the past.
So could we then just adapt that process for this?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
As soon as it's clear, how many you want. And again, I honestly think thinking back to the SSA, you could very easily have a group of 50 that serves as your sounding board and provides direction, just like we did with the SSA. And then it's distilled down. The final product comes to the board for recommendation and approval.
So yeah, if Director Rose and or Dr. Sue would get us the information that was used for the SSA, then we could work on adapting that for this process. And then identifying specifically what the roles would be, and then send something forward that they could then, get out as far as outreach.
Right. Any other questions, comment? We are right on time, 2 minutes ahead of schedule, which is remarkable and awesome. Well, thank you both for all the work and for the team from the cabinet side. I feel like this was very productive. I feel like we've got a pretty clear sense of where we're going. And yeah, if you need anything from the board, let us know. Well, with that, we will adjourn the meeting at 6:59 p.m.